And it's not unlike the stages of grief when everything you've got burns down.
He was the man behind the velvet voice, a crooner with a tragic glint in his eye and a legacy steeped in smoky clubs, satin sheets, and silent losses. Boz Scaggs, once the sonic architect of the 1970s smoothest sound, now lives in relative quiet, far from the limelight that once adored him. But behind the mellow rhythms and high society real estate, there are ghosts. Behind the stage lights, hidden wealth, estranged children, and a slow, painful reckoning. Why did Boz Scaggs walk away from fame just as the world bowed to him? And what has been quietly unraveling in the years since? Even at the peak of his fame, Boz Scaggs was something of a mystery, a reluctant star. While other performers of the era courted publicity with bombastic flair, Scaggs slipped through the cracks, hiding behind thick sunglasses and cryptic lyrics. But before the Grammy nominations, before Silk Degrees, before the heartbreak and the hideaways, there was a boy from Plano, Texas, a boy named William Royce Scaggs. Born in 1944, he was raised in a buttoned-up household, the son of a traveling salesman. The rules were strict, the expectations high, but Boz, a nickname given by a schoolmate, floated just outside of reach. He didn't fight the system. He quietly ignored it. The rebellion wasn't loud. It was internal, woven into the way he watched the world from a distance. In his teens, he picked up a guitar, more out of restlessness than ambition. But fate would push him toward a crossroads when he met Steve Miller at St. Mark's School of Texas. The friendship was instant, a musical bond that would anchor his early career. The pair later attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison and formed several bands, most notably the Steve Miller Band. But even as they found early success together, Scaggs always felt like an outsider in someone else's dream. By 1968, he'd recorded a solo album in Sweden, dabbling in folk blues with little commercial impact. It wouldn't be until the early 70s that his voice, haunting, soulful, and unmistakably smooth, would begin to penetrate the American mainstream. But Boz didn't crave celebrity. He wanted control. And control meant disappearing when the cameras showed up. Behind closed doors, he was beginning to craft something rare. A life adjacent to fame, but protected from its burn. He married Carmela Storniola in 1973, a strong-willed, grounded woman who gave birth to two sons, Austin and Oscar. The couple settled in San Francisco and later Napa Valley. It seemed idyllic, private, controlled. But fame doesn't let go easily, neither does pain. And Scaggs, the phantom of blue-eyed soul, would learn that even the smoothest life can unravel, and fast. The 1970s were a golden blur for Boz Scaggs. With the release of Silk Degrees in 1976, he transcended cult status and entered the stratosphere of American pop music. The album was a slow-burn success, peaking at number 2 on the Billboard 200 and staying on the charts for over 100 weeks. Hits like Lowdown and Lido Shuffle became radio staples, the soundtrack of an era defined by velvet suits, sun-kissed convertibles, and cocaine-slick charm. But while the media scrambled to define this new blue-eyed soul, Scaggs was already slipping away. He wasn't interested in superstardom. He was more interested in what fame could buy him: freedom. And he spent lavishly. Vintage cars, hillside mansions, and art collections quietly flowed into his portfolio. One of his most opulent acquisitions was a Napa Valley estate, a property that would become both sanctuary and prison in the years to come. By the early 80s, Scaggs had withdrawn almost entirely from the public eye. His marriage was faltering, his sons were entering adolescence, and the music? It no longer fed him. He announced a sudden retirement in 1981. To fans, it was baffling. He was still charting, still relevant. But to those close to him, the signs had long been there. The man never seemed comfortable in the spotlight. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He wanted to control what people saw. And when the industry pushed too hard, he simply walked away. He spent the next decade quietly investing in San Francisco's culinary scene, co-owning the famed Slim's nightclub, a space that served as a cultural watering hole for elite musicians and jazz aficionados. His money multiplied, but so did the silence. By now, his marriage to Carmela had ended, though neither spoke publicly about the reasons why. Rumors swirled of infidelity, of long absences, of emotional detachment. The Boz Scaggs that fans remembered, the sensual crooner, was long gone. In his place stood a guarded businessman with shadows beneath his eyes. Meanwhile, his sons were growing up fast and dangerously. Austin, the eldest, seemed to inherit his father's musical sensibilities and flirted with a career in music journalism. But Oscar, the youngest, became increasingly troubled. He drifted, struggled, vanished from the public altogether. Behind the gates of his Napa estate, Boz tried to hold it all together, but cracks were showing. Money insulated him, fame obscured him, but nothing could protect him from the tragedies about to unfold. It was the genre no one wanted to admit they created. Yacht rock, a term coined decades later, encompassed a sound defined by smooth grooves, gentle percussion, and a glossy sheen of luxury. Boz Scaggs, alongside Michael McDonald, Kenny Loggins, and Christopher Cross, was one of its accidental founders. But unlike the others, he never embraced the label. To him, it was reductive, a glib tag slapped onto complex emotions. But whether he liked it or not, Scaggs had become the face of affluence. His music played in high-end boutiques and martini lounges. He wasn't just making records, he was selling a lifestyle. And that lifestyle was carefully curated. Boz's homes reflected his paradox, ultra-private and hyper-luxurious. His San Francisco mansion, a Mediterranean-style villa nestled in the hills, was cloaked behind gates and foliage. His Napa Valley property, sprawling across acres of vineyards and custom architecture, was more fortress than home. Inside, there were wine cellars, recording studios, rare paintings, and security systems worthy of a diplomat. The cars, collectibles, Ferraris, Jaguars, and a Porsche or two, each representing a different chapter of his aesthetic evolution. But these symbols masked something darker, a growing distance between Boz and the outside world, and between Boz and his sons. By the mid-1990s, Scaggs had begun to re-enter the music scene. Albums like Come On Home and Dig received critical praise, but little mainstream attention. He wasn't chasing hits anymore. He was chasing relevance, or maybe redemption. On stage, he appeared almost spectral. The voice was intact, but the spark had dimmed. He rarely addressed the audience. He rarely smiled. And when he left the stage, he returned not to after-parties, but to solitude. The illusion of the yacht rock dream was collapsing. The money was still there. The music still flowed. But beneath the surface, grief was preparing to strike. In 1998, tragedy hit home. Oscar Scaggs, his youngest son, died of a heroin overdose at the age of 21. The details were murky. The press barely covered it. But for Boz, it was the end of something essential. The ultimate failure, one that no amount of fame or fortune could soften. He would never be the same. Grief doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits quietly at the edges of privilege, unspoken, but ever present. After Oscar's death in 1998, Boz Scaggs retreated even further from public life. The Napa estate became a vault. The phone calls grew fewer. Interviews were rarely granted. When they were, He chose his words with surgeon-like precision. There would be no tabloid outbursts, no public weeping, but those closest to him could feel the shift. The lightness was gone. What remained was a man obsessed with control. Behind the wrought iron gates and vineyard rows, Scaggs was no longer just a musician. He was an empire builder. Through a series of savvy investments, he'd become a silent power broker in the Bay Area. Properties were purchased under LLCs. Restaurants and clubs bore his name, but not his presence. His wine label, Scaggs Vineyard, won awards and praise, yet few ever saw him at public tastings. It was all curated, all protected. His brand was no longer tied to the charts. It was tied to legacy. But legacies can lie. While the public saw success and sophistication, insiders whispered about estrangement. His relationship with his surviving son, Austin, had grown strained. Austin had carved his own name in music journalism, writing for Rolling Stone and becoming a familiar face in New York's music circles. But he rarely mentioned his father. Some speculated that grief had created distance. Others suspected deeper wounds, abandonment, resentment, disillusionment. Boz, for his part, never spoke of Oscar's death publicly. There was no tribute album, no charity foundation, not even a song. But there were signs, subtle, haunting signs. His music turned darker. 2003's But Beautiful, a collection of jazz standards, felt like a dirge disguised in elegance. Reviews called it melancholic and eerily restrained. Fans praised the vocals, but something was off. There was no joy. His friends noted changes in behavior. He declined invitations, grew paranoid about privacy, became obsessed with landscaping details on his properties, to the point of micromanagement. Some described him as reclusive, others haunted. It wasn't just the grief. It was the cost of a life built on silence, the cost of being an icon who never let the world really see him. And the empire he built? It was stable, yes, but it was also empty. Boz Scaggs had once walked away from fame at its height. Now, in his 60s and 70s, he was fading by choice. And no one knew exactly where he'd gone. Yes, he still released music. 2013's Memphis, 2015's A Fool to Care, and 2018's Out of the Blues showed that his voice had aged like a fine spirit, smokier, sadder, but still magnetic. Critics raved. Audiences at his live shows, now mostly older, seated crowds, wept. But the man himself remained elusive. He didn't attend industry events, didn't show up at awards shows. Even on tour, he was rarely seen outside the venues. No fan selfies, no backstage passes. He'd appear on stage in tailored suits, offer a few words, perform immaculately, and disappear into the night. It was a pattern, a disappearing act refined over decades. Boz Scaggs wasn't avoiding fame out of fatigue. He was avoiding connection. The few journalists who were granted interviews found him polite, but distant. When asked about personal matters, he offered polished deflections. He spoke of process, of craft, but never of pain. He refused to address Oscar's death or the state of his relationship with Austin. "Some things are meant to stay within the family," he once said, eyes narrowing. "But even secrecy has a cost." The more Boz withdrew, the more myths filled the vacuum. Internet forums speculated about his health, his wealth, his mental state. Some believed he was battling depression. Others assumed he had gone full Howard Hughes, living in total isolation, surrounded by art and ghosts. In truth, Scaggs had built a fortress, not just of stone and steel, but of silence. And within that silence, time was catching up. Friends noticed he no longer attended gatherings. Business partners reported slower responses. Neighbors saw him walking the vineyards alone, often at dusk. There were rumors of health scares, Nothing confirmed, but enough to worry those who still cared to ask. The Boz Scaggs of the 1970s was long gone. In his place was a man vanishing in plain sight. For a man so defined by his voice, Boz Scaggs had a lifelong aversion to saying the hard things out loud. And nowhere was that more tragic than in his role as a father. Oscar Scaggs's death in 1998 was no isolated tragedy. It was the culmination of years of turbulence, drug use, run-ins with the law, and periods of estrangement. But unlike many celebrity parents who leveraged their fame to fight for their troubled children, Boz stayed quiet. He funded private rehab stays, paid legal bills. But emotionally, he remained distant. Austin, meanwhile, seemed to be holding the pieces together. He built a career in the same industry that had once consumed his father, but from a different angle: writing, producing, editing. He appeared in panels, contributed to legacy publications, and earned a reputation as thoughtful and sharp. But interviews with him revealed a man still processing a deep, unspeakable grief. "My brother had a lot of beauty in him," he once said. "He just didn't know what to do with it." There was no mention of Boz. It was as if the family had fractured along invisible lines, not through scandal, but through silence. No lawsuits, no public fights, just a slow, quiet drift. Observers speculated that Scaggs carried an unbearable guilt, one that he refused to name. Perhaps he saw too much of himself in Oscar. Perhaps he couldn't face what he hadn't done. The songs released in the decades since bear traces of mourning, but no clarity. No song is about Oscar, and yet every lyric feels haunted by him. One rare glimpse behind the curtain came during a small 2016 show in Oregon. Scaggs paused between songs and told a brief story about watching the sunrise from his vineyard. He mentioned how quickly the light fades, then caught himself. "I used to watch it with my boy," he muttered, before launching into a cover of Whispering Pines. The moment was gone as quickly as it came. In his 80s now, Boz lives surrounded by material comfort. The net worth estimates range from $30 million to $40 million. He still owns properties in Napa and San Francisco. He drives vintage cars. But what matters most, legacy, family, peace, remains complicated. One son gone, one son silent, and a father who sings to ghosts. The estate sits quietly among the rolling hills of Napa Valley, an immaculate sprawl of curated elegance. To the casual observer, it's a dream realized, a symbol of taste, wealth, and retreat. But to those who know the man who owns it, the house is a kind of mausoleum, a place for memories, for mourning, and perhaps most of all, for hiding. Boz Scaggs acquired the property in the early 1980s, long before Napa became the playground of Silicon Valley royalty. Back then, it was still a rustic outpost, known more for its soil than its luxury. Scaggs saw it differently. To him, it was a sanctuary, far from the glare of Los Angeles, the noise of San Francisco, and the ghosts of the music industry. He built his world carefully. Vineyards that yielded boutique wines, a recording studio buried beneath the hillside, and interior spaces adorned with mid-century restraint. Nothing loud, nothing unnecessary, only what mattered to him. Over time, the property became more than just a home. It became a controlled ecosystem. Scaggs could spend weeks there without interacting with anyone beyond a tight-knit circle of staff. Friends who visited remarked on the silence, how even the air seemed heavy with reverence. He'd walk the vineyard rows alone in the early mornings, a cup of black coffee in hand, stopping occasionally to examine a vine as if it were a mirror. Inside, the walls told their own stories, framed photos from the 70s, him with Carmela, with his sons as toddlers, backstage snapshots with musical giants, dotted the hallways, frozen in time. But in recent years, many of those images had been removed, replaced by abstract art and minimalist decor. Perhaps the memories had grown too heavy. Though semi-retired from music, Boz continued to record in private, often refusing to release tracks unless they met his perfectionist standards. Rumor had it that there were dozens of unreleased songs stored on hard drives, never to be heard. Some were said to be unfinished ballads dedicated to Oscar. Others, angry pieces critiquing the shallow commercialism of the modern music industry. Whether or not they'll ever be released remains unknown. Visitors dwindled over the years. Carmela no longer came. Austin visited occasionally, but the warmth was gone. Conversations were said to be stilted. They sat in silence over dinner, avoiding the elephant that had been sitting between them for decades. Boz had wealth, security, legacy. But the laughter, the music that once echoed through those halls, those were gone. Even the wine, once a passion project, had become more about business than pleasure. The Vineyards label won awards, but Boz rarely drank anymore. In his own version of exile, he had built a castle. And like many kings before him, he found that the walls kept more than the world out. They kept the past in. Style always came easy to Boz Scaggs. Whether it was the slick suits, the vintage rides, or the effortless fusion of rock, soul, and R&B in his music, Scaggs had a gift for aesthetic. He wasn't flashy, he was cool, understated, smooth, the kind of man who turned heads without raising his voice. But cool is expensive, and it always comes at a cost. In the 1970s, Scaggs had it all: commercial success, critical acclaim, and a cultural aura that made him the quiet envy of his peers. He wasn't a household name in the way Bowie or Jagger were, but in music circles, he was respected, revered even. Collaborators from that era recall how meticulous he was. He didn't just want to make hits, he wanted to craft something lasting, something elegant. Yet, as the years wore on, the image began to harden into a mask. The man who had once used style as an extension of identity now relied on it as armor. When Oscar died, Boz didn't show up in public with grief. He showed up in tailored jackets, sharp shoes, and carefully rehearsed detachment. When asked about aging, about legacy, about family, he brushed it off with a dry wit, an arched brow. Always composed, always in control. But control is not the same as peace. There was a cost to being that untouchable. He struggled to form lasting friendships. Even in his bands, turnover was frequent. Former musicians spoke of admiration, but also emotional distance. "You never really knew Boz," one longtime drummer once said. "He could be 5 feet away from you and still feel like a ghost." In the 2000s, as the yacht rock revival swept pop culture, fueled by nostalgia and irony, Boz became a reluctant symbol of a genre he never embraced. TV shows and comedy sketches poked fun at the smooth sound he helped create. His songs reappeared in films and commercials, often stripped of their emotional weight. Boz neither condemned nor celebrated the trend. He simply stayed quiet, issuing the occasional tour date or album drop, but never stepping fully into the conversation. It wasn't just cultural. The distance extended to family, too. When Austin began making a name for himself, many wondered if the two might collaborate. Father and son, 2 generations of music minds. But it never happened. Whether due to personal rifts, philosophical differences, or just years of silence, the opportunity passed. The public wanted a neat arc. They wanted Boz Scaggs to rise, fall, and return. Older, wiser, more open. But that never came. Instead, he remained an enigma, untouched. untouchable. That's the cost of cool. In the long canon of American music, Boz Scaggs is a whisper, a thread woven through dozens of iconic albums and moments, yet rarely centered in the narrative. He's the voice behind songs that defined an era, the co-creator of bands that shaped genres, the businessman who built cultural landmarks, and yet he often goes unmentioned in the stories we tell about 20th century music. Why? Because Boz Scaggs never played the game. He didn't chase trends, didn't cultivate celebrity, didn't sell his tragedies to Oprah or memoirs. He chose mystery over myth-making, and in doing so, he became invisible, a ghost in his own legacy. But his influence is undeniable. Without Boz, there's no smooth R&B crossover in the pop mainstream. No lineage from soul to soft rock that bridges cultures and generations. His fingerprints are on Toto's earliest records. His voice echoes in the harmonies of Hall & Oates, in the grooves of Steely Dan. The studio musicians who cut their teeth on Silk Degrees would go on to define an entire era. He built the frame, but others hung the paintings. And yet, Boz never seemed bitter about being overshadowed. In rare interviews, he shrugged off questions about influence. "If the music speaks for itself, it doesn't need me," he once said. Still, there was an ache. A sense that perhaps he had disappeared too well. That in his quest for privacy, he had become a footnote. His most recent albums, while beautifully produced, received little attention beyond loyal fans. Critics praised them, but the industry barely noticed. No Grammy tributes, no Kennedy Center honors, just soft applause and silence. As he turned 80, there was no biopic, no major retrospective, just a quietly aging man, still recording in private, still walking the vineyards alone. Fame had moved on, but Boz remained, the forgotten architect. He is 81 now. Time has softened the edges of his presence. The hair is thinner, the movements slower, the voice more fragile. But when Boz Scaggs sits at a microphone, even now, something electric happens. The pain, the grace, the decades of silence all converge into a single, trembling note. He doesn't need lights, doesn't need applause. He just sings. And in those moments, it's as if the years never passed. But offstage, the questions linger. His fortune, estimated to be around $40 million, remains largely untouched. His properties are well maintained but sparsely used. The vineyard continues, as does the music. But the family? The connections? Those remain fractured. He and Austin reportedly speak occasionally, but no reconciliation has been made public. There are no interviews, no joint appearances, just a quiet, uneasy peace. So what remains? A legacy in music, certainly, a discography that stretches over 6 decades, a sound that influenced generations, but also an absence, a silence so thick it feels intentional. There are no memoirs, no public reckonings, only hints, only shadows. Boz Scaggs was never meant to be a superstar. He wasn't built for the spotlight. He was built for the margins, where beauty and sorrow meet, where songs carry what words cannot. And maybe that's where he'll stay. A man of velvet shadows, a father, a recluse, a phantom of blue-eyed soul. Boz Scaggs built a life most would envy. But behind the smooth surface, there was loss, silence, and scars that never healed. As he enters his twilight years, the question remains, will the world ever truly understand the man behind the music? Or was he always meant to vanish between the notes? Subscribe for more untold stories of fame, failure, and the truths they tried to bury. WC 4016